It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for joining us, and thanks for the panelists for also making time. Briefly, I'm Gaurav Singal. I'm a computer scientist and a physician. I actually did my training here at Harvard and Mass General, and when I was a resident, I did my senior talk on the future of AI in medicine, and I had a picture of a robot holding a doctor bag, a digital sort of futuristic doctor bag. And that was a long time ago, as you can probably tell. But the folks on the stage here are the ones building that robot, sort of metaphorically, I think mostly. And so it's a real pleasure to hear from them about the work that they're doing, some of the challenges they're facing, and where they see the field going. So we're going to spend about 40 minutes together. We have a few questions that we've prepared to talk through that I think cover some really interesting topics in the area, but this is also sort of an audience participation type of setting. So please, if you have your app, feel free to ask questions through that, and I can see them on the iPad here, and we'll ask them toward the end. And otherwise, there's somebody walking around with a mic, and so hopefully we'll get a few minutes toward the end for questions. So anyway, with that, maybe we'll start the session with introductions from each of the panelists. If you would please go around, introduce yourselves, your background, the organization you represent, and the work you're doing on bringing AI to the clinical bedside. Muthu?
Yep. Thanks, Gaurav, and it's great to be here. Thanks for moderating. So my name is Muthu Alagapin. I'm the founder and CEO at Counsel Health. I have a kind of eerily similar background to Gaurav. It sounds like data science, computer science background, became a physician, trained here in Boston, was on the faculty for a little bit at MGH. I also did my senior talk on the future of AI in medicine. So
more recently than me, though.
Maybe by a bit, yes. Counsel Health is an AI-enabled virtual care company, and so our mission is to multiply the world's clinical capacity. We deliver virtual care with an in-house 50-state medical group that we own and operate, but the primary focus of the company is actually in building AI applications to supercharge and power that clinical group. So we've built what we call the clinician cockpit, which is an interface that our physicians use to deliver virtual care. That helps them not just be more productive and efficient, but also higher quality. And just one other thing I'll say on background is, at least at Counsel, we think a lot of the problems in healthcare are derivative to a massive supply-demand mismatch, namely a lack of supply. And so a big focus of the company is how do we multiply the world's clinical capacity? And we like to think in multiples, not percentages. So what does it look like to 5x or 10x the number of clinicians in the world? And we think a lot of that has to happen from new care model design and hybrid interplay of AI and human doctors working together. And so that's what we focus on with the clinician cockpit, and I think stuff we'll get into. But yeah, great to be here.
Great, thanks, Muthu. Esther?
Yep, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll just say I'm filling in with really big shoes. Rebecca Mishuris, our Chief Medical Information Officer, should have been here. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it. So Esther Kim, I lead our emerging technologies team within Mass General Brigham Digital. So our team is tasked with thinking through broadly emerging technologies where about 70 or 80% of our work right now is around artificial intelligence. And our team is tasked with this crawl, walk, run phase of how we safely and test and implement new technologies across Mass General Brigham. And certainly AI has been a very interesting journey over the last couple of years. Specifically, a few things that we'll highlight and mention around AI is around our ambient documentation that we started piloting a few years ago, which is now scaled enterprise-wide, which is an incredible feat, as well as a lot of the work that we are doing not only with clinicians, but broadly around our employees to ensure that we're thinking about effectiveness and productivity across Mass General Brigham.
Awesome. I'm Shiv, founder and CEO of Abridge. A little bit about me. So prior to this, I used to be an executive at a large health system in Pennsylvania called UPMC. A couple lifetimes ago, went to Carnegie Mellon. In the middle, became a cardiologist. I most recently, over these last several years with Abridge, we've been building with this thesis that healthcare is about people, and that's not going to change. Professionals on one side of the room, patients on the other, whether it's virtual or in person. And if that's not going to change, if we're not going to fully automate a doctor or a nurse, then dialogues, conversations drive so many care delivery workflows. And they're an opportunity for us to build a new kind of platform that over time can do any number of things, starting with unburdening clinicians from the clerical work that certainly crushes my soul at night when I see patients. And so that's the really high level in the company. Incredibly privileged to be here with this panel.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Rue. I'm the Global Chief Medical Officer for Microsoft. I'm a physician, a technologist, a health services researcher, and I've been in healthcare tech for the past 30 plus years. A big area of focus for myself and Microsoft is understanding how the technologies that we have today, specifically cloud and AI, allow us to be able to do things that we could never have envisioned before. So at Microsoft, we have the data infrastructure that supports security for the data sets, allows us to be able to think of the infrastructure, the ways that we can interoperate within different systems, but also the AI stack. And the AI stack has certainly gotten a lot of attention, everything from large language models to smaller language models to agentic models and orchestration with AI. So a tremendous amount of things that we're seeing in the industry, but my role is to specifically understand how this new set of technologies can be used in a clinical setting so that we can improve health outcomes.
Wonderful. As you can see, we're quite privileged to have this group up here and delighted to be moderating this conversation. I'm going to go off script right from the beginning because you brought up, Muthu, that you similarly had a presentation, maybe with a robot holding a bag. Shiva's just said that medicine is a deeply human profession. I can certainly empathize with both sides of that. And yet you plan to 5 or 10x sort of the clinical capacity. So maybe just for the two of you, if you could comment on how do you see the role AI playing in the clinical sort of care continuum, and does it replace parts of it? Do you feel like, Muthu, that there is a impending robot doctor, maybe less mechanical than that sounds, or I'm curious, and maybe there's a time horizon to this vision. So if you could briefly, each of you, comment on that, that would be great. You want to go first, Shiv?
Yeah, sure. Well, there was a survey a few years ago that suggested that 2 out of 5 doctors didn't want to be doctors in the next 2 to 3 years. There's research from JAMA that suggested that 27% of nurses didn't want to be or don't want to be nurses in the next 12 months or so. And so we certainly have the supply-demand mismatch. We have rural health systems shutting down, patients driving 5 or 6 hours into the inner city hospitals to see the rheumatologist who can potentially, change their life. And so we've got to do something about that in the now, in the here and now. And at the same time, we've got to think about where these technologies can take us later. There was an American Journal of General Internal Medicine article that was published a couple years ago that suggested that doctors need 30 hours a day to get all of their work done. And so we've got an incredible opportunity with the new tools, the new primitives that we all have access to actually point those tools in a way that can bend the trajectory for healthcare in the direction that we want to see it go. About a month ago, my father-in-law in New York, we were walking to go to play with my kids in a park, and he tripped over a crack in the sidewalk, fell down, really healthy person, broke his hip, total hip replacement within about 48 hours. And over the course of his hospital stay, I was there with my wife for most of it, as much of it as we could be, and it was so clear to me that so much of care is so deeply human. At the same time, per that American Journal of Internal Medicine article, there are so many tasks that we can go after sooner rather than later. And so when you think about all those different tasks, you can almost think about like the high stakes, high frequency sort of tasks, or even lower frequency tasks, but the higher stakes tasks are probably the tasks that we're going to have to be really responsible about being able to automate over time. But there are so many high frequency, lower stakes tasks in healthcare. There's so much that happens, in the back office, for example, that we can go after sooner rather than later. The last thing I'll say, maybe to transition over, is that I still see patients. So about maybe 1 weekend a month I'm routing in the hospital, and when I'm seeing patients, I'll oftentimes use I'll always use a bridge, but I'll also use some of what we're building in the clinical decision support space, just to sort of get a sense of where these models are. And generally speaking, these models, when you give them enough information, they can help you get where you want to get to sooner, faster. And if you don't feed them enough information, oftentimes it feels like we're starting way left field and it takes 2 hands to clap and you're going back and forth. It's very dialectical. You get somewhere maybe you couldn't have gotten before, and you feel even more confident in your decision to choose whatever the therapeutic or the diagnostic was than you were before. So they turn you into a superhero. There's no question about it. And I think that refrain, at least in the near term, that refrain around clinicians who use AI will replace clinicians who don't, I think absolutely rings true, and that's why it's on the tip of most people's tongues anymore. And at the same time, there is a lot of low acuity care that is delivered in this country, and how will we think about, delivering that kind of low acuity care in the future? And I'm sure Muthu will kind of unpack, but there's been a number of really interesting and provocative research studies over these last several months even that suggest that some of that care, especially on the low acuity side, can be delivered in new creative ways. Ultimately, it'll be really exciting to see how we can leverage them and scale them and hopefully unlock new business models.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Shiv said, actually. And just to, I think, address your question head on, Gaurav, which is, I think is, will we get to a point where we can automate clinical care itself, sort of an AI doctor, as people often refer to it? So the way we think about this question is, first, let's consider the doctor as only the cognitive aspects of medicine, because I think the procedural aspects is more of a robotics question, and there's other elements there. Within the cognitive aspects of medicine, I think the limitation to automating that with AI is, maybe helpful to divide those tasks in two categories that doctors do. Number one are competency-based or ability-based tasks, like can you train an AI to diagnose, a certain condition, to read a radiology scan, or to review a pathology slide. The other category are almost license-related tasks, so things that only a physician in this country or certain states can do with a medical license. I think the rate limiter to sort of having an AI doctor is very much that second category. It's probably mostly going to come down to when we can remove the license limitation of, even if an AI knows that Augmentin is the right prescription, it's not allowed to prescribe it in this country for good reason. But I think that's really the stop on kind of getting there. I do think, actually, fairly optimistically, that the cognitive aspects of medicine that are competency-based, like diagnosis, coming up with an assessment and plan, we're going to make significant headway in over the next 3 years, to the point that I think in many cases, and many papers already kind of bear this out, I think an AI does outperform a clinician given the right data inputs in a vast majority of cases. And I think we're seeing that both across low acuity and even higher acuity conditions. So I think we're going to get there, and I think, again, probably the thing that'll hold us back the most is what we allow an AI to do from a license and regulatory perspective.
Well, that's a great segue. Maybe let's talk about licensing and regulatory frameworks. I think in some ways you've highlighted two potential paths that have been discussed. One is you're taking a pathology assay, you're making it computational. We know what that looks like, right? That's either a medical device or a software as a medical device, and FDA has established or emerging frameworks to deal with those. Now, we also have a history of licensing doctors, right? And that looks like licensure and credentialing and recredentialing and maintenance of certification, to the chagrin of many physicians in the room, myself included. So as you think about it, maybe Esther and David, if you'll take this question, how do you think about, either from the health system perspective, Esther, or from your clinical hat or your technologist hat, David, how do you think about the evolving regulatory environment, maybe either from the perspective of what's happening or what do you think should happen? And then as a nuance to that, how do you think about that in the context of evolving large language models and underlying technology that's hard to predict how it'll change? So whoever wants, Esther, do you want to go first?
Okay. Sure, I'll go. One of the things that we have heard is that the current approach for how we look at how we regulate and manage a lot of the medical devices today doesn't work for AI. And largely it's because the AI has many other complexities associated with it. First and foremost, it can change over time. These machine learning models, they can change. Even asking the same question to the generative AI, you can get different responses. So the question then is, how do you regulate something that has all these other additional challenges? And what we've landed is that if you wanted to simplify, I guess, the process down into 5 key things. One, you have to know what AI is running in your system today. So you have to be able to do an inventory of that. 2, you have to be able to test those models on local data sets or data sets that are representative of the populations that you currently serve. And a corollary to that would be you have to monitor those those models in terms of post-deployment, which is what we don't really do a whole lot of. We traditionally say it's FDA cleared, we don't need to worry about it. But the reality is, at this point, we not only have to look at the models, we actually have to look at the outcomes, because the outcomes themselves may have unintended consequences. And this ties into another thing that we're seeing. the biases and the unintended consequences associated with AI. And so thinking about that and looking at these things that we don't normally look at requires another layer. And then lastly, you have to oversee this in a manner that's somewhat streamlined in terms of governance. So like you've now got a whole lot of new responsibilities, and what we've come to realize is that no one organization, specifically a regulatory organization, can do all of these things, let alone even a health system. And so for that reason, we've launched several initiatives in this space, one of which is called the Trustworthy Responsible AI Network, of which Mass General Brigham and multiple other sites are a part of. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to find ways that we can operationalize a lot of these responsible AI principles and make it easier for organizations to do it. And ultimately do it in a way that we can learn from each other. And that's going to be probably the new model, where we're no longer relying on one agency to validate a model for all purposes, but that we think about ways that we can create a sustainable way to test and monitor these in a way that is resource efficient.
Yeah, to emphasize on David's point, from a health system perspective, that full scope of the AI life cycle management is where it's truly critical and where we're mostly challenged with, especially after that initial validation, ensuring that you have continuous monitoring, not only for bias or drift or hallucination, but even broadly for model performance is an aspect that, it really hasn't been solved yet. And so we need to think through, from Mass General Brigham's perspective, being a little bit more conservative and being very methodical about how we are launching AI solutions within the system. That is a really important aspect as we think about regulations. And then, of course, with many of these external collaborations, whether it's with Train or Coalition for Health AI, Health Management Academy, and many of these other collaborations that we're truly learning from each other, because this is a new and evolving space and things continue to change. And also ensuring that we have some of our internal set standards and guardrails as well to ensure that we're educating our employees and our clinicians on what are the important guardrails, on what are some of the important protections as you continue to leverage generative AI. Certainly AI has been out there, for a number of years, but helping folks understand how truly generative AI and some of the outputs that are being produced is truly different, and how it's so important, whether you call it human in the loop or human at the helm, is a really important component right now, especially when it comes to any kind of clinical areas of work.
That's great. I have so many more questions, but we'll hold off on that for now. I want to talk about this idea of drift, which can happen for lots of different reasons, but also from evolving models, right? Anybody who's used any of the consumer tools around this knows that a new model comes out, there's a lot of excitement, and yet there's also recognition that not everything got better, right? Maybe some things got worse. And so I'm going to split this into two questions. Two of you get to be the optimists, two of you get to be the skeptics. Sorry for the team assignments here. But Muthu and Shiv, I'll make you the optimist, if you will. But if you look back, some of us had this conversation 12 months ago, right? And the state of technology, I think, was quite different 12 months ago. So as builders of some of these tools, first of all, has it changed meaningfully? And if it has changed meaningfully, what are you and your organizations able to do now that would have been harder to do 12 or 18 or 24 months ago as a result of underlying model performance? So that's a question for you two. And then I'll come back to Esther and David with a view on, is it still improving in the future? But I'll ask you that question after they get a chance. So again, the question is, in the last 12, 18, 24 months, have you seen sort of meaningful changes in underlying model performance? And if you have, has that changed what you're able to do on the product side? Muthu, you want to go first?
Sure. I'd say, to start with, I feel like since 2022, all of our calibration of what's meaningful has totally kind of gone off scale because of how amazing these technologies are. So I would say, I would call the improvement over the last 2 years incremental, like significantly incremental, but still incremental. Since GPT 3.5, I don't think in clinical AI use cases, and again, as a company, we work directly on the clinical, non-administrative side of AI care. I'd say we're seeing mostly incremental progress. So things like context windows getting bigger, inference getting better, underlying model performance getting better. But the model still hallucinates, right? It hallucinates less, but it still hallucinates. And we still don't have a great form of mechanistic interpretability. We haven't solved superalignment. And so a lot of the more kind of foundational challenges, I think, still exist and persist. But we have seen meaningful incremental changes. I'd say a lot, every time there's a new model release from any of the big frontier companies, we'll plug it in. We have a pretty robust, hundreds of evals that we sort of test the models on. So it's very easy for us to plug in a new, let's say, OpenAI model, rerun all the evals and see the performance, and there is, big step change improvements. It's almost like in the hospital just working with a more talented resident after a new, shift in schedule, and it's just that everything they're doing is better. The notes are better, the reasoning is better, the diagnosis is better. And you can still teach and train and fine-tune, but we do see these kind of meaningful step changes and improvement with each model release. But to your point, we also do see some regressions. And this is why building an AI, it's in some ways it's really fast to make progress, but it's also really slow. And the reason it's slow is that the models are probabilistic and there are regressions, and it's not obvious where the regressions are. So every time we plug in a new model, we're spending a lot of time looking for, it got better in 90% of the domains, but it got worse in 10%. We don't know which 10%. It's always a different 10%. And a lot of that initial time is spent, figuring out where it regressed and how to go fix that. But yeah, overall, certainly in the optimist camp, and I think we will see those more kind of paradigm shifts and hallucinations and alignment to come. I just don't think we've seen that yet in the last 2 years.
That's great. Shiv?
Yeah, well, as a consumer, I spend most of my time on an airplane, it would seem, and I'm talking to ChatGPT, my best friend, and they say that GPT-5 is more sycophantic. I don't think so. I think it's very, very honest with me. But
You said GPT-5 is not lying to you? Is that what you said?
no, they say it's very sycophantic. I was just
I
making
see.
a joke that I kind of love the back and forths where you say, here's some context, give me the answer, and then you're like, no, you missed this, and then it's like, oh yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for giving me that extra little bit of feedback, and I'll get somewhere better. There was like a venture capital firm manifesto that was published last year about where AI was moving at the time was sort of akin to that book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where the thinking fast moment was where you prompt a model and you're instantly getting that dopamine feedback. It's almost like this content was regurgitated, memorized, and the thinking slow moment where you can actually get a job done, where these models can unpack the problem into its constituent parts and then reason through it to the actual end zone and even maybe do the job, do the work. And what's really exciting, I think, given that we've all as an industry figured out how to deal with orchestration, how we've been able to kind of reach down deeper into the stack in some ways, we've been able to get after, I think, closer and closer to an end zone on any number of different jobs, but we still have these challenges like hallucinations. We're at some scale now where we're doing millions of conversations, doctor-patient encounters every week, and anymore, one of the big kind of stepwise improvements for us has been post-training. All of the edits that clinicians make on a daily basis against all the artifacts, the unstructured or structured outputs that we're serving them, we can learn from them. And learning from them in and of itself, I think, is game-changing in certain ways. I think many vertical AI companies anymore, the playbooks come down to distilling models, fine-tuning, post-training, as much as possible training your own models, because then you have that much more agency, even if there is an off-the-shelf web-scale model that you're leveraging in some way, shape, or form in the pipeline. On the hallucination side, we're all having to be that much more creative. So for us, we published a paper a couple weeks ago about what that looks like for us is where one model, we have multiple models that are looking for hallucinations, one model that's sort of trying to find them and grade them in terms of severity, and then a separate model that is basically figuring out how to remove the very severe hallucinations programmatically. And so what we were able to demonstrate is that our hallucination rate goes from, and removal rate goes from an 82% if you're using an off-the-shelf web scale model to 97% for our specific use case. So As much as like the floor is rising, and there was this great Sam Altman quote from years ago that said that if a new model comes out from an OpenAI or another foundation model company and you're sweating, well, you're on the wrong side of things. If the new model comes out and you're celebrating, well, then you're absolutely, you're set to be able to surf these incredibly historic waves. And that's how we've tried to position ourselves. So as much as the floor keeps rising, we're able to leverage that new floor. We also recognize that for our very specific narrow use case, we have to go millions of miles deep, and oftentimes that requires us being able to orchestrate these models together and as much as possible own and control our own destiny. So I think that's more possible now than ever before.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, two things. One, Shiv, it sounds like you're sort of making the point that you've got generalist models that have to be performant across an incredibly broad set of use cases. When you get to the narrow, that's the reason these sort of vertically specific companies exist, like the ones you all are building. And then, Muthu, I really liked your analogy to a resident. I've often thought about the sort of idea of a co-pilot in medicine. We have those, right? They're called interns and residents, but are not omniscient and need sleep and graham crackers. So I guess the question then to put to the other side of the table, Esther, to you and David, is are the capabilities plateauing, right? Can the residents keep getting better, right? Or are we seeing, to your point about incremental, Muthu, it feels to me that we went from 3 to 4 and 4 or 5 or whatever and along the R03, and it felt like some of those were reasonably profound improvements on the consumer side. But I think there's been a lot of debate about, is 5 even an upgrade, right? And people maybe calling out their regressions more than they have in the past. And so I guess my question to you two then is, do you think that LLMs are plateauing in their capabilities? And if so, what are the implications for the step change that happened, I think, in energy around the AI physician? Do you see a plateauing there, sort of short of superintelligence, maybe keeping us from getting all the way there? So Esther, maybe you first, and David then.
I think it really depends on the use case. So that with the various models and the continued evolution, we certainly have a sandbox environment that our clinicians, our researchers, our innovators are also able to experiment and play in this space and to be able to evaluate new models. We're finding that overall there may be some plateau. In other cases, it's also thinking through exactly what type of model do you need and why. There's also, as a health system, right, thinking through our digital infrastructure, there's a cost that's important as part of these newer models that are also broadly more expensive. They can be more creative and therefore may not be as useful in that certain use case. So those are some of the areas where I'm a little bit of an optimist but also pessimist in being very realistic about how we are implementing some of these newer models within our system.
Yeah, so when we evaluate large language models, we typically look for a benchmark. And there are some standard benchmarks out there that we oftentimes use to evaluate performance. And if you look across every model, you'll see that it has dramatically improved and then it's tapered off. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is because it's hitting a level of expertise that is now making it very difficult for it to achieve those same goals that we saw before. So if you go from GPT 3.5 to 4, you see major jumps. But then when we're starting to hit an accuracy level that's anywhere between 85 to 90% on some of these benchmarks, you're not going to see that 35% jump anymore because there's not that much room for improvement. So there's an element to that's happening. But if you were to take a closer look at the actual models themselves, we're now starting to establish new benchmarks, and we're starting to look at other things beyond simply the performance on a specific set of questions. And we start realizing that there's so much more that it's actually capable of doing. We're adding multimodal data sets that are now expanding our horizons in terms of what type of questions and what kind of things we should be evaluating. And we're looking at ways that we can apply AI in things that we never have thought of. And one of the things that gets me really excited is about the new way of thinking about how AI may be applied in the future. So many of us have talked about agentic AI, but I want to maybe do a double click on that because a lot of times people think of it as an agent does one task. So a human says, do this, and the agent does it. But what we're actually moving towards is this world where there are multiple different agents all doing a set of tasks, but they're all interacting with each other. The Microsoft research team about 3 months ago published a study called it was called MAI DXO, Medical AI Diagnostic Orchestrator. And they were trying to answer the question, could you use agent orchestration in a way to improve diagnostic performance? And rather than just using one big model to answer this question, what they decided to do was they broke it up into 5 tasks. The first was a hypothesis generation. So the agent only looks at one thing. All the inputs, it comes up with a differential diagnosis. Second agent takes that and it actually looks for the tests associated with each of the different differentials. The third looks for guideline concordance. It looks to see which ones are consistent with the current guidelines. The fourth actually looks to see what's the cost effectiveness of all of this. And the fifth is sort of your naysayer, your challenger, your quality assurance, and it says, well, have you thought of this and all these other things? And the agents all work together in a way that allows you to be able to come up with some trade-offs, and ultimately a human has to then decide which trade-off is appropriate. And I think that's where we're heading right now. We're starting to move away from one model does everything to a series of different subtasks that can be organized in a way that allows us to address some very complicated questions. But by specialization and orchestration, we may be able to solve some of these. And that just changes then the whole paradigm of all the things we're thinking about. So my feeling is, I know you threw us in the pessimistic category, but
I knew you'd find your way
we're
out,
very
David.
optimistic. And we think that, even though we continue to raise the bar and continue to expect more and more from these, it just continues to hit those benchmarks. And eventually we're going to get to the point where it will be things that we feel very comfortable in clinical practice for some of the more challenging things that we do.
Well, you've brought specialization up again, David, and now maybe even subspecialized into all these different tasks, and maybe the implication also is that the specific models are particularly well suited for the subtask there. Let me maybe play devil's advocate there, right? So, many people, I think I heard a stat that some absurd number of ChatGPT questions are health related, like 20, 30%, something on that order. I knew it was a lot, but that felt really shocking to me. It shows how important health is to sort of everybody's life. And there was recent criticism that there used to be a disclaimer, this is not medical advice, consult your doctor or whatever, and some of those disclaimers are sort of falling off now, some of the consumer apps. And so I guess that begs the question, number one, if these models are saturating in their performance, there's a lot of money that has gone and is going into these. Health is a hugely important area for everybody. Do you see a world in which these entities, the frontier model developers, start to vertically integrate, sort of verticalize, at least into healthcare, maybe other industries? Maybe the barriers are, Shiv, what you said, that you can't get sort of sufficient model performance, not to steal your answer, but maybe they'll get there, or maybe they'll build verticals to do that, and all of them have health groups now and so on. So maybe an open question for anybody who wants to take it, since we're running short on time here, but the question really is, do you see frontier model developers getting more deeply into healthcare and maybe taking on some of the specialized problems, at least for the consumers, right, for whom that is a front door for many of us, but maybe even for health systems that have increasing enterprise contracts with these organizations. So open question to anybody.
I can say definitively yes. There are a lot of organizations that are now looking at ways that they can apply these models to help consumers address many of the healthcare issues and challenges they have. I also think that we should probably look at the types of questions that people ask and put sort of a different set of criteria on them. There are some questions that people ask that today, with all that we have available, they can do a very, very good job. So if you have a complicated history and you want to understand what it means in layman's terms, the LLMs can do a great job at that. This is like something that's in their wheelhouse. If you are trying to, you're struggling with the diagnosis and you're saying, well, what else could it possibly be? This LLMs is great at hypothesis generation and being able to do things like that. There are many things that it can do today. Now, we should also, at the same time, recognize there are things that it probably shouldn't be doing quite yet in terms of managing one's medical care without a clinician. But I think if we were to kind of think about all the challenges that consumers have, it's more than just simply one thing. It's a whole series of things, and we should probably organize to say, these are the things that we know are safe, effective, and reliable, and here are the ones that probably need some more research.
That's great. Maybe I'll take it from there. It almost feels like, there's this historical trope that every startup founder has heard from their board. Well, what if Google decides to do that? It feels like today it's, what if ChatGPT can do that, right? But maybe that brings us to a question that was posed here, and we can close on this and then let you leave final thoughts, is liability, right? It almost seemed like at the end there, David, you were getting to this sort of point of, well, they shouldn't be making the final decision, or, as they get into clinical reasoning. maybe there's a threshold that's too high or a liability exposure that is unpalatable, right, for many of these organizations. Epic has said that for a long time, right? We won't go into the regulated domain, although unclear if that still remains a red line. Question for you. First question is, do you view liability, how do you view liability, and who will own liability in sort of the future that you imagine, whether it's augmenting or maybe sort of replacing parts of or whatever? And then a flip side, an optimist view of this question, which came in from the audience, do you see a future where maybe malpractice insurance requires that you demonstrate use of an AI copilot because it's improving care so much, which I like that framing a lot better. So open question to anybody. Maybe Esther, if you want to start, and then somebody else can pick it up.
Sure. I think I love the optimist side of it, that there's definitely potential. I think we do have a ways to get there to better understand where generative AI truly can be impactful, especially in clinical care. I think Shiv said it very accurately. There's so many more opportunities in the low-hanging fruit right now, whether it's documentation burden. For example, we're seeing a lot of chart summarization also being an area that we can truly impact. And what is that level of risk that we're willing to take? Ultimately, it is currently still within the clinician, right? It's within the physician to be able to sign off on that note or sign off on that order, and I don't think that's going to be removed anytime soon. The future is very interesting.
So the liabilities with the docs in that case?
The liability, I think, still lies within the doctor
Yep.
or with the health system, because they're the ultimate right caregiver that's signing off on that note, signing off on that order, for now.
Muthu, maybe I'll throw the question to you, because I think you envision the most ambitious future with maybe some replacement. So curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly big proponents of physician-in-the-loop care and having liability fall on the medical group in that case, just because of the way infrastructure is set up, and also just even the emotional ability to say, as a patient who may be harmed by one of these actions, to be able to attribute the blame. It's very kind of confusing, even philosophically, to say it was an AI system that made this error. So all of the care we do has a physician in the loop for supervision. I think you're right, though. I think a lot of the foundation model companies are towing the line very aggressively on the practice of medicine and providing medical advice. And I think there's a lot of benefit to that in terms of access to care. A lot of these low acuity clinical conditions people can get advice on for free when they otherwise maybe would have had to go see a doctor. But the double-edged sword there is, I think, you do run into issues with hallucination or with medical errors. Or we also see the flip side issue of almost over-escalation of care. So if you come to ChatGPT with something that sounds like it could be a medical emergency, let's say you're 30 and healthy, but you say, I have some chest pain, maybe you were playing tennis the night before, a lot of times these models will say you need to go to the emergency room. That's an emergency, and it's because they don't want to take liability. They're going to err on the side of over-escalating to in-person care and to acute care, even if unnecessary. So I think one of the things we have to keep an eye on is, does kind of greater consumer use of things like ChatGPT actually lead to overutilization of acute care resources? Because these models, trying to avoid liability, err on the side of higher false positives, higher over-escalation. I think that could be an unintended consequence here that we have to get ahead of. So I think we're overall quite cautious and even concerned about these companies, practicing medicine without saying they're practicing medicine for a number of reasons. I think on our end, we think physician in the loop is quite necessary, at least in the early days.
Super interesting, especially the sort of modern instantiation of defensive medicine, which we've all experienced on the clinical side. Let's close out with maybe down the line, starting with you, David, and then working our way down. In 5 or 10 years, what do you think is the vision of where AI sort of ultimately lands in clinical care? And maybe the twist on that is, in that vision, who's paying for the AI? And maybe everybody can take a stab at that, and we'll wrap on that note. David?
So I'm going to talk about 3 things. One, I think there are some transformative use cases that we don't really think a whole lot about because we're so focused on the patient, when in fact the rising cost of healthcare, the fact that we have a large number of individuals that don't have access to affordable healthcare, these are things that AI can actually help us with. You can screen large populations, identify individuals that have high risk, severe disease, that we can bring them to care in a timely manner through risk stratification, which can also be done through AI, and capacity building through virtual care programs. If we were to put these together, we can address population health measures. And so use cases, I think, are going to be extraordinarily important down the road because they have a clear ROI. 5% of individuals account for 50% of the total cost of care. 20% of individuals account for 80%. If we could find those 5% before they actually have the heart attack, the stroke, and these key issues, we could have a huge impact. The second is around trust, and I think trust is extremely important for us to think about, from not only the trust with the AI, but trust between individuals and clinicians and patients. And that's when we were talking about things such as the Trustworthy Responsible AI Network, responsible AI, building and governance. If you don't have a governance process, if you haven't evaluated the models, if you don't have mechanisms to do that, it's hard to build trust, and I think that's going to be a big part of it. So trust will be the second thing that will be a big part of the future. And the third, which we haven't talked a huge amount, but is probably one of the most important things that we should be talking about, is AI upskilling. If we don't skill a population so that they can properly utilize AI, we will run into the scenario where people will lose their professions because AI can do things just as well. And it would be such a shame, because we actually have an opportunity to augment care in such a way that if we were to build the programs that allow us not only for certification, but also for securing a job, we could potentially change the paradigm. And so that's on us. That's something that we can do. We can put together AI skilling, upskilling programs, and ultimately create a job certification program that ensures people that use AI will get those jobs.
Thanks. Shiv?
Yeah, I think the most optimistic thing I can think of is new business model innovation in healthcare. That's what we need more than anything. You think about Baumol's cost disease, once you start to see it, you see it everywhere. And we know as a country that it's existential that we leverage this technology to find a way to realign all the different stakeholders around what's most important, which is the patient and their experiences and their outcomes. We talk about this word, we use this word disruption a lot in technology, and I think the most disruptive thing that this technology can do is find a way to align. In Q2 of this year, we, at a bridge, we were invoked by 2 of the national payers in their earnings calls. And the reason was because we were costing them a little bit more money because we're generating these more complete, more compliant notes, these documents, on behalf of doctors. And in healthcare, you're not compensated as a provider for the care that you deliver. You're compensated for the care that you documented that you deliver. So every single one of these notes is a bill. And so the worst thing that could happen is that they wouldn't call us, but it would just turn into agents versus agents, and it's like a race to an even more steep sort of cost disease curve. But thankfully and optimistically, I think the most exciting thing happened. They reached out to us, and we ended up actually sitting down with them and figuring out where we could create win-wins, where we could actually innovate on new models of care together with their members and their affiliated kind of provider networks. And so I think that's probably, in my mind, what needs to accelerate more than anything else over these next 3 to 5 years for us to really reap the true benefits for this technology at a societal level.
Thanks, Shiv. Esther?
From a health system perspective, everything, of course, that we do is in service of the patient. So as we think about AI and where it's going to go, it's thinking through the hyper-personalized care that we can provide for our patients, the experience that we can provide not only in some of the education that we can provide for the patient, quicker access, better triaging, ensuring that the patients really get the optimal care. So if it's a new clinical trial that comes up, the patient can be quickly alerted to that. I think to David's point around population health management, much more proactively identifying patients that have diabetes or hypertension and ensuring that they get their appropriate care. And also preventative care is a huge component, right, as we think about our larger patient ecosystem. So I think that's where I'm most excited about in terms of thinking through where AI can truly impact how we think about patient care and improvements and efficiencies across the health system, again, in service of the patient. In your question on who should pay, I think that it really depends on who's getting the benefit from that technology, and then also working very closely with whether it's our commercial payers or with CMS and others of where are the benefits, who really should be thinking through the reimbursement models, and is that on the health system, is that on the payer? And hopefully the cost is not transferred at all to the patient, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen on what is that reimbursement model going to look like in the future.
Thanks, Esther. Muthu?
Yeah, I'd say, I'll say a couple things. One is that I think we've done a really good job with AI in healthcare over the last 2 years of applying it to existing care models to make them faster and more efficient and even more enjoyable to practice medicine. And so we've taken existing care delivery systems and almost retrofitted AI into them in a very productive manner. What I'd hope to see in the next 5 years is a bit of rethinking underlying care delivery models to begin with. So almost this thought experiment of, if we could go back in time 100 years and know what we know now about what exists with AI and other technology components, how would we sort of rethink care delivery at more of an elemental atomic level? So rather than applying AI to what we have, how would we sort of redesign the system from the ground up if we knew what we knew now? And I don't think you can choose one or the other approach. I think you have to do a bit of retrofitting. But I think us and others are also trying to think through the lens of, what if we could start over, and would care delivery look the way it does today if we knew these components exist? So that's one thing. I think the second thing that we're really optimistic about is sort of the pursuit of what we call perfect doctors. And in our mind, perfect doctors have these 3 characteristics. One is that they're kind of infinitely accessible, right? Any time of the day, anytime you want them. It feels like a doctor that is only taking care of you. The second is that they're hyper-personalized, right? So they start to know you and your care preferences better than you may know yourself. And then the third is that they're extremely knowledgeable. And so they can start to be knowledgeable across specialty domains. They're not confined to a single specialty of knowledge. They can take the medical information that doubles every 73 days and sort of memorize it and retrieve it sort of on demand. And so we're really excited about that type of future, a future in which the next 10 billion people on the planet are born and have access to a perfect doctor their entire life. And again, one that is accessible, knowledgeable, and personalized. And we use the adjective perfect because I don't think that has to be an AI doctor or a human doctor. It's probably some hybrid of the two. But we think that world is possible and within reach. And on the ed tech space, some of you may have heard of alpha schools, but there's a quote from their CEO that says, now is the best time in the world, in the history of the world, to be a 5-year-old, because education is going to totally transform and they're going to be the beneficiaries. And we hope the same is true in healthcare, that now is the best time in the history of humanity to be born, because your healthcare will be hopefully kind of approaching perfect over the next course of your lifetime. And again, that's very aspirational, but one that I hope we can get to. And I think that's what gets us most excited. In terms of who will pay, I think what we're really excited about there as well is that we can start to approach perfect care at the cost to compute. And so the cost of healthcare becomes less of this elephant in the room and more of something that's very easily surmountable by governments, insurers, or even individuals.
Well, thank you all for a wonderful discussion. My takeaway is AI is going to bring us robots, oracles, and maybe value-based care. Thank you all so much.